Welcome to Seattle Sucks, a podcast about hating the city that we love.
And other cities while we're at it.
Oh, hell yeah.
Because...
What do you mean, Greg?
Well, today, we have Rebecca Parson, candidate 2020, Washington 6th, and we're going to talk about Tacoma. Anyway, we normally have 2 episodes a week, but one of them that this would have been, we normally release behind the dreaded paywall on the Patreon.
Yep.
But we decided to share this with you because Rebecca is really cool, and you should hear about her from her.
Yeah, I mean, the freaks were really pissed. They love hoarding that content from you.
That sweet, sweet content.
But we had to do it.
We pried it from their freak hands.
Yeah, and Greg, is it not correct that we have many congressional candidates being interviewed behind the paywall?
So many primary challenges, so many Patreon-only episodes.
Some say that Adam Schiff wouldn't have won had we not interviewed him.
Yes, some say that.
Some have just said that now. Anyway, enjoy this interview and give us money.
Do it.
You can hear more. There's a backlog of episodes you can hear. Just give up one Starbucks latte a month, and
Just
for
one.
that
That's all we
market
ask.
price, you can hear all that content.
Yeah. Also, Patreon fans, I'm very sorry about last week. That was my fault. Just know it was my fault.
They
okay?
literally don't even know what you're talking about.
You will. When it comes out, you'll know what I did.
We had an episode come out 3 days late.
Oh my gosh.
Dun, dun, dun.
It was me, okay? I
It's
did.
always Colin's fault.
Mm-hmm.
Even if it isn't, he will apologize. Anyway, on to the episode.
All right. We have a very special guest, Rebecca Parson. Thank you for joining us.
Hi, thanks for having me.
Yeah, thanks for coming.
Yeah,
definitely.
You traveled a long distance, and that's because you are a candidate for Washington's 6th congressional district.
Yeah, I came all the way from Tacoma.
Exactly. For us, that's
to your
like...
fair city. That sucks.
For the 5 weirdos that listen to our show from out of state, they're gonna look at a map and they're gonna be like, Tacoma to Seattle. That's like a suburb to a city or something like that. But they don't understand. It is the most awful fucking traffic that has ever existed.
Yeah, 7th circle of hell.
Yeah.
If hell was a straight line instead of a circle, it would be the distance between Tacoma and Seattle.
because you can't even take the light rail yet, right? Like you can get just past the airport, right?
Yeah, there's a Sounder train. It only runs during certain hours, and then there's a bus. The buses get super packed, so a lot of people have to stand the entire way from Tacoma to Seattle.
Oh, shit. Yeah. Yeah, that's
Sitting in
awful.
traffic, standing on a bus. I don't know which is worse.
Well,
Yeah.
Managerial liberalism would tell you that was good for you. That's exercise.
So
system
you
works.
are primarying the incumbent sort of corporatist Democrat, and I gather you wanted to come on this show because we think of, you recognized immediately that we think of Seattle as a punchline in the way that everyone has always thought of Tacoma.
Exactly.
So yeah, we're here for it.
Yeah, I think this all started when a friend of mine tweeted something related to your podcast, and I responded and said, do you think they'd have me on to talk about why Tacoma's better? And so that's why I'm here.
As the only Seattle podcast that has no city spirit for this city. That's cool. You want to come shit on this place? I mean, great. Yeah. I'm not promising to say anything nice about Tacoma, but
I might say some nice things.
Mutual disparagement.
Yeah, great. Yeah. I mean, really, at the end of the day, I bet we'll find out that really we're more alike than different.
It's like Tacoma, Seattle bipartisanship.
They're both awful.
Yeah, we're all in it together. It might be useful for all the Seattleites that listen to the show to know what the 6th congressional district actually is. And so, I mean, that's part of Tacoma. It's not all of Tacoma. It's most of Kitsap Peninsula, which includes Bainbridge, and it's the Olympic Peninsula as well. And I think there's 5 counties in that district,
which is big,
which is pretty wild. I mean, that's a giant swath of land there. And now, did you say that you're living in Tacoma?
Yeah, I
presently?
live in Tacoma, and yeah, it is a giant district, and it's very diverse. I mean, Bainbridge and Aberdeen are very different from each other in a lot of ways, but I have found commonalities going across the district. So the people who work at the Safeway on Bainbridge can't afford to live there, and the people in Aberdeen just can't afford to live.
Yeah.
And there's the city of Aberdeen, town of Aberdeen, for example, has 16,000 people. It's a population. They have 1,000 homeless people, so 1 in 16.
Jeez.
Yeah. Yeah, and I definitely want to get into discussing Aberdeen, but we generally will save the most depressing elements for but yeah, so it's a huge district, right? And one that is a little different than say Seattle, right? And that you have rural towns, they're old sort of like lumber towns like Aberdeen and stuff like that. And then awful cesspools like Bainbridge. Yeah. That's your words, not mine.
I just lost the election.
We should also
shit on my own district.
Point out for people tuning in from the 6th that this election is actually next year. It's
That's
not
true.
the one
Yeah.
that's coming up and if the ballots are dropping for.
It's November 2020. Is that correct?
Yeah.
But
It's the big one.
But you
The
can
on-year.
just write Rebecca's name on any ballot you have between now and then and turn it in.
Yeah, you can do that.
And you can
I'll
do
take
whatever
it.
you want.
That's what they call that's the early voting I keep hearing about, right?
Right,
You just
something
go ahead
like
and
that.
write it on the thing and send it in.
Yeah, I don't think you're mistaken about that.
So before we start talking too much about the district and how we're the same but different and all that, maybe we should hear a little bit about your biography. Like, for example, astonishingly, but not at all really, you're apparently both the first woman and the first queer person to even think about running in this district.
Yeah, it's pretty wild. I'm not just the first to ever hold the seat, but ever to even run.
Yeah.
And so it's pretty weird.
That's wild.
When I realized that, I was like, "That's wow! Huh, I wasn't expecting that." But in terms of my background, I grew up moving around a lot. My dad was in the foreign service, so I grew up overseas, moving every 2 to 4 years.
Cool.
And and then I was born in Virginia, and then overseas till I was about 12. Then we moved back and bounced around a lot, and then moved to Tacoma, and I really loved it. And my cousin is from Alaska. He lives there, and he's like, "Oh, Tacoma." But I was like, "What are you talking about? It's really nice. I really like it. The aroma's gone. I don't."
Gertie no longer gallops.
Yeah, Gertie, no, doesn't. And we also have 11 Wonders of Tacoma, and the giant Pacific octopi living in Gertie are one of them.
Oh, wow.
Just FYI.
Oh, wow.
That's super cool. I didn't know that.
Yeah.
Well, yeah.
But it's really nice. I like it. And I love Tacoma. I think my favorite Tacoma anecdote is the first time I went to Tacoma City Council. And there were people there protesting something the city council had done, and they thought that TPU, Tacoma Public Utilities, needed to be audited. And so this woman got up and she was like, blah, 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 and what we need is, and then she couldn't think of the word. And somebody in the audience goes, audit. And then somebody else goes, audit. Audit, and we all just start chanting audit, audit, audit. it's like Tacoma city government is like Parks and Rec.
Yeah.
But there's no Leslie Nope.
Sure,
We're all just really passionate, and they're not listening to us.
Yeah.
And we're like, do what we want, and they won't listen. And I don't know. I find it's really endearing. It's like a perfect Tacoma story.
So say Seattle city government is also like Parks and Rec, but only in that we have the Patton Oswalt character just rambles on and on about crazy shit. Except for he's also really racist. That's our addition. So you're also not just a resident of Tacoma, but a member of DSA, and I assume DSA is supporting your candidacy or whatever.
Yeah.
But what brought you into left politics?
Well, when I was in college, I had friends who talked a lot about the Zapatistas, and then for a summer trip, like summer study abroad, kind of, they went on a program in Mexico. A couple of my friends where they went to the Zapatista language school that they have, and after college, I went to Guatemala to learn Spanish. And I also I had heard about the Zapatistas and had their form of self-governance and found it really fascinating. So I went to the language school for a week, and then I connected with a local nonprofit to do 2 10-day trips to a Zapatista village as a human rights observer.
Whoa.
So basically you're just, at that time, the situation was such that the Mexican government was funding groups of like neighboring villages that were not Zapatista to threaten the Zapatista villages, and just having like white foreigners there would prevent most of it. And then if anything did happen, we could document it. So I did that, and it was really inspiring and cool to see because they are, indigenous Mayan. And, Subcomandante Marcos is called Subcomandante, or was, because there is no Comandante. There's only the subcommandant. And he's just he was a spokesperson. And, the infant mortality has gone down, maternal mortality has gone down, literacy's up, like women's rights are much stronger than in surrounding areas. And it was really inspiring. So, and around the same time, I read The Shock Doctrine by Naomi Klein. And that opened my eyes to a lot of things. So then I kind of, did a lot of other stuff over the years. And then when I was in Tacoma, I started seeing popping up on Facebook so there was an apartment building called the Tiki Apartments in Tacoma where a developer, I believe from Seattle, so thank you.
You're welcome.
Bought this apartment building and evicted everybody. Many of them had been living there for years and years.
Yeah, sounds about like Seattle.
Yeah. And like 14-day eviction notice, which was legal. And this was like really the last stop for a lot of people there, like people with felonies who couldn't find anywhere else, on disability, people in recovery. And it was like this was their stop between being in a home and not being in a home. And so evicted them so that he could renovate and raise rents. And out of that came the Tiki, turned into the Tacoma Tenants Organizing Committee. And I wasn't involved in DSA at that point, but Tacoma DSA was very involved in helping with that. It's a tenant-run organization, but DSA and tenants in DSA were very involved. And so the first kind of whispers of DSA that I saw was on Facebook, these socialist longshoremen showing up to the Tiki Apartments to help the tenants move.
Hell yeah.
I was like, this is really badass. Like they're really doing the work. It's not just political, like that's part of it, but also like these people need somebody to help them move. And the
Longshoremen
socialists are
showing up anywhere makes an impression.
Yeah. They just showed up with their trucks and helped them move. And I had friends who were involved as well, and like one of them was like, yeah, so and so, like her phone got shut off and she needs $30 to get it back on, and all just like really practical stuff being taken care of at the same time that they were forming a democratic tenant-run organization, which is like so different from the typical nonprofit hierarchical liberal do-gooder model. And like they went and like showed up at City Hall and demanded changes, and they got them. And we've had tenant changes to tenants' rights laws in Tacoma. There's now a fund for relocation assistance if you're low income. And so that was kind of like my intro to DSA and like what the work that DSA does. And then AOC winning, talking about herself as a democratic socialist. That's kind of when I decided to join DSA.
Oh, nice.
Yeah.
Well, and that story about the Tiki building, I think, leads to sort of an interesting point about Tacoma, which is that the, absolutely insane housing situation that's been happening in Seattle, right, has spread like a illness to all the surrounding areas, and Tacoma being one of them, right? So the rising rents, impossible to buy houses and stuff, all that has now moved to Tacoma, right?
It has, yeah, definitely. A lot of people from getting priced out of Seattle moving to Tacoma, but then a lot of people even who move to the area for a job and they can't even afford Seattle to start with, so they live in Tacoma and just commute. Yeah. And it's the paper called Tacoma the hottest housing market in the country because it has the highest rate of rental increases. So, it's not as high as New York or San Francisco, but just the rate at which it's rising is the highest in the country. And like, I'm a renter, and my rent has risen 16% in the last 3 years, and it's really a lot. And a lot to deal with. And people even, people in Seattle are getting priced out moving to Tacoma, which is pricing out people out of Tacoma, and they're moving to Lakewood. And it's like, but then once you hit Olympia, it starts to get expensive again. So then, where do you go? It's just kind of this endless flow.
And that contradiction sort of like sums up our times. It's like the hottest housing market.
Yeah.
Like you want to fuck it, but it wants to evict you. What? Where do you even start?
Exactly, hottest. Like we had, this past winter was really bad. Like people died of exposure in Tacoma.
Yeah.
It's like it's pretty not a hot housing market for them.
No.
It's just for
Yeah.
the real estate developers.
Yeah, and I know that like over the last year, I've definitely like heard in the winds, hear people talking or whatever. People saying like, oh, I have a friend who wants to move up here, but it's so expensive, so I'm telling him just to go to Tacoma or whatever. And I remember the one that really like kind of struck me was when over Pride. A lot of people in Seattle were like, oh, fuck Seattle Pride, let's go to Tacoma Pride. And I mean, that's all well and good and great. I'm glad that they feel comfortable at Tacoma. It was one of those things where it's like, this can't be good if you're paying rent in Tacoma. Like everybody in Seattle wants to come down there. That's not a good sign. Like,
Yeah.
that's generally not good.
No, that's what everybody. That's been like a narrative around Tacoma, like just that you hear in Seattle is as Seattle gets priced out and gentrified. Tacoma's cool now. But what that seems to really mean is like Tacoma's just at an earlier phase of gentrification.
Right. Yeah.
Where like, oh, there's some restaurants and bars actually opening up in some neighborhoods that you maybe can afford to live near.
Yeah.
And
Well,
it's just like, just wait, Tacoma.
Yeah.
Well,
Just wait.
it's how Brooklyn became cool in the 90s because nobody could afford Manhattan anymore, right? And it's one of those things that I think speaks to part of your platform, right, that you're writing on, which is this idea of social housing, right, to try and ease this. I mean, maybe we could talk a little bit about that.
Yeah, because I mean, the housing across the district, like in Tacoma, there's a lot of gentrification, especially on the hilltop, and people getting priced out. They can't afford to live there anymore. And the hilltop is predominantly African American community, really strong cultural heritage and history there, and so there's a lot to lose, and there's a lot being lost as that gentrification's happening. And in Tacoma is gentrification, but when I talk to people on the Northern Olympic Peninsula, they're like, yeah, these rich assholes from Seattle and California, and they don't use the word gentrification, but they're getting priced out.
Yeah.
And it's all over in Aberdeen, people, there are college students sleeping in their cars. And, if you have a town of 16,000 and 1,000 homeless, something's obviously wrong.
Yeah,
I think for me, as especially, democratic socialists, like my view of it is that the housing market has become just a profit generator. And that's the motive. Like the main purpose of housing is to generate profit, not to house people, which is the exact opposite of what it should be. And so for me, it's like the two big prongs of a housing policy to fix this. One is rent control. And obviously, Shama Swant's very vocal on that in Seattle. And then in Tacoma, the Tacoma Tenants Organizing Committee is vocal on it as well. We do have the statewide ban, but, people are working on it. And we've had wins in Oregon and New York and I think California as well. But what's interesting and that I didn't realize until I started looking into it was that we used to have national rent control. We had it during World War II. And then Richard Nixon also instituted it as a ploy to make himself more popular, and it worked.
Go figure.
Yeah.
Yeah.
And Truman wanted it because he thought it would stave off communism. Go figure. But so we have had it.
Probably not the wrong idea.
Yeah. Yeah. And I looked into it, and it's just... it's tough because so much of housing policy is hyper local, and then you get the worries like from city council or the developers or whatever, like, oh, well, if we get rid of the tax breaks for developers, then we'll have capital flight. Nobody will want to build here anymore. And, poor old Tacoma. I was like, Tacoma's great. Everybody wants to move here now. We don't need to keep giving them money to build unaffordable housing, but that's a thing.
Well, like, this is interesting because, we're sort of a Seattle-centric show, and we're right in the middle of a big election, 7 city council seats up.
Of 9, yeah.
Yeah, and they're, and actually ballots should be,
out.
when you're listening to this, they should be like in your mailbox or on your coffee table right now. But we've been talking a lot about that. I've been out door knocking for Sean Scott. And a lot of the narrative, at least a lot of what I've been talking about is like, so Sean Scott in District 4 is talking, so Shama in District 3 is talking a lot about rent control. Sean Scott wants to build public housing as a city. And on this podcast, as well as occasionally, if I get in some really long conversations knocking doors, I start talking about how, the first step is to acknowledge that these are actually like national problems that we should be dealing with on a national level. But we should do something if that's not going to happen on the national level. Right now, under the current administration, we should do what we can on a local level. But you're actually running to have power at the highest levels of government. So yeah, how does this look? What does this look like? What is addressing our housing crisis, our sort of crisis of poverty in general, look like on a national level?
Yeah, and it's a really good point because it's really hard for cities to come up with the money. There's a school board member I was talking to in Chimicum on the peninsula, and she was saying, and it's the same for school boards as for city councils. It's like she said that it feels like quicksand, and you never get stable footing because you can never find the funding that you need. And like when they want to, they have to do needed repairs in a school. They try to put forward some measure to be approved by the voters. They always vote it down because they don't want more taxes. So they had to just close a school and put two school buildings together, and so that they could fire a principal. And that's the thing with city councils, with local governments, like they have limited funds. They don't, like the federal government issues currency. It sets interest rates. Like it has a lot more power than city council, than city governments, and they have to make do with the limited, finite amount that they have. But it's really a false scarcity. Like the federal government could provide a lot more money to cities. Like if you think
Control
about
the most powerful currency in the world.
Exactly, yeah. And I think it's just really backwards, that housing policy, that we do not give more money to empower cities to take care of the crisis, but then also that we don't have these national policies. Like we could have national rent control. Bernie Sanders came out for it. I believe AOC did as well. And I've been in touch with the people who informed Bernie and on his policy. And like it was a national coalition of people who put this together. They call it the Homes Guarantee. So it's rent control and then also accompanied with 12 million new units of social housing in the next 10 years. That's how much we're short. So some of that would be new construction, some would be rehabbing, but it all interplays because I'm also supporting the Green New Deal, and the Green New Deal includes a federal jobs guarantee. So a lot of those jobs could be constructing all of this, like living wage union jobs to do all this construction, and then having it be carbon neutral housing because buildings are a major source of emissions. And so it gets to be really exciting because then you can, when the federal government, instead of spending billions and billions and billions and trillions on new airplanes, on all the new stuff we need to continue our regime change wars overseas, and instead put it into making the people of the country's lives better. There's just like so much that could be done, and it's just kind of maddening to realize. Like I've been talking to some MMT economists, modern monetary theory, and they're like, well, if you think about it, like we went into World War II gung ho right after the Great Depression, and how did we do that? Like everybody was too broke to tax. Like they didn't have any money to tax. That's not how we funded it. We funded it because we came together and we decided, like we used the public money and did it. And we can do that same thing now.
Yeah. What it turns out too, as a state, like you can actually, because you can mobilize people and resources, you can actually just tell people to make things too. Like, I mean, this question of money really is like a false question in a lot of ways. But I think the thing that's interesting is that, during the original New Deal, a lot of the public housing was built, by people in New Deal programs, right, who were putting to work, right? And we had this opportunity in 2008 where we had people all being thrown out of their houses. We had, mass unemployment, particularly among construction workers, right? And it's always one of those like opportunities that's just completely unseized, right? If we could have had a serious housing program and just didn't.
Yeah, like, absolutely, yeah.
It just gave $10 trillion to banks.
Yeah.
But yeah, I mean, so I think that's interesting. And I just want to tie this back to the point you brought about like housing being this local issue, which is I think part of this is this little like shuffle game that the right and people who believe in austerity politics kind of play on all of us, which is, housing's a local issue for city governments to decide until the city government decides they want rent control. Then the housing, the real estate interests in Seattle will ensure that a state law gets passed that makes it a state issue, right?
Yeah, right.
And then if we fight it at the state level, right, they'll make it a county issue or they'll push it to the federal level or whatever. And so I think that too, it kind of is pointless to get lost in these, like, is it this issue or that issue, right? I think you just have to fight for it, right?
Yeah, and just find what combination works. Like this kind of philosophical states' rights stuff. It's like it's only states' rights when it's what you want, and then when it comes to like abortion, suddenly we need to go federal. It's not a state rights issue anymore. So it's just, I think it's kind of just a, philosophical, endless discussion where it's, for me, it's really like we have like millions of people who need housing, lots of people in my district. What's the best way we can do it through a combination of, local, federal, state?
Yeah. Well, I don't nerd out because I'm above that, but I'm very excited to hear you talk about modern monetary theory and something I've sort of harped on this podcast. Once you get into Congress, inevitably, what is the narrative? How do we combat this narrative? Like, so the debt, the national debt has been the sort of meaningless, inane cudgel that the right and for some reason, the Democrats have used against basically anything. It's perfect because it just encapsulates everything. It's like, no, we have to spend way less money as a federal government. What's the path? What's the rhetorical or strategic or whatever path to writing this narrative to where we, as a country, can understand, no, we have this enormous actual real wealth at our disposal that we can use to level the playing field, to enrich everyone in this country and the fucking world, rather than just rich people, and that's by spending U.S. dollars because we fucking make them in a printing press.
Yeah, and it's really it's tough because the metaphor that they use on the right and then conservative Democrats is like, well, it's like a household budget and the kitchen table.
Fucking kitchen table.
It's like, except like if I'm in a ton of debt, I can't just print my own money to pay it off. Like that's not the metaphor doesn't work. But there's not the best I've heard, and I've talked to a couple MMT economists, and one of them was like, okay, think about it. Here's one that maybe you can tell people, but it's not as simple as the kitchen table thing, but it's kind of helps. Is so you go to like a sports game and you buy like tickets to purchase popcorn or whatever. Like you give them money, they give it to you, and then you give it back to them to get the popcorn. What do they do with it? It's just this kind of like circular economy. They can just create more of those and more of those. Yeah. And he's like, we do, like, do they burn it? And he said, the Fidel Kaboub. And he's like, we do actually. I said, I was telling this to a constituent and who I met on Twitter, and she was like, we've been, my mom and I have been talking about this, and we're just kind of disturbed because, our whole lives we thought that it was our patriotic duty in a way, like to pay taxes. That's kind of like the left's version of your patriotic duties. Well, I may not send my kids to public school, or I may not have kids, but I pay taxes because I'm a good citizen. That's the thing I do. She's like, but it turns out that's not the way it works. Like, what do they do with the extra money? And I asked him, and he was like, they burn it. Like they literally burn it, or they'll just shred it or give it away as souvenirs or whatever.
Yeah, that's why I think I think you have to go really deep to change the narrative and start talking about why they burn it, and that's inflation, right? And I think you actually have to go to the root of why they actually don't want us to spend more money, and that's because they don't want the money they hold in dollars to be less valuable. And once you start saying, well, if there was more inflation, it would make rich people less rich, and it would make you less poor because your debt would shrink, and that's the only thing that's stopping us from spending more money as a federal government. I think you start to see that spending more dollars and more federal debt is really just a way to redistribute wealth. And I think you have to start that broadly.
Yeah, and I think, I don't know, I've been thinking a lot about the metaphor. I haven't been able to think of one that's as neat and easy to understand as the household budget, the kitchen table. But one thing that's
what's great about the right. Like, they don't care if it actually means
makes
anything.
any sense.
Like, what's the dumbest, simplest thing we can say?
Yeah, it's frustrating. And one thing, though, that resonates and is like really easy to understand and say quickly is like, okay, we bailed out Wall Street. Did our taxes go up? Like, what happened to our taxes after that? They didn't go up. So how did we pay for it?
Yeah.
They printed the money.
Yeah.
And
this is good. Yeah.
And so, or we can say like Great Depression. We then had to send millions of soldiers overseas. We had to construct thousands of planes. Detroit stopped producing cars for consumers. It only produced airplanes. How did we do all of that when people were living in shanty towns? And there was literally, we could not tax them because they had no money. We would just like tax them nothing. They didn't have anything. How did we do it? Like we created the money. And so,
and I mean that era, it's sort of important, historical benchmark or even metaphor to use too, right? Because the other part of it is that when the federal government saw that people were unemployed, it was able to just snap its fingers and be like, we can just give them jobs, right? Like this idea we live under this mystical belief that we're all beholden to the market, right? And if, the market demands a 6% unemployment rate, well, that's what we just have to do. And that's just how people have to live, right? If, Seattle's going to be so expensive or Tacoma's going to be so expensive, the way people living on the streets, I mean, what can we all do? We're all just beholden to it. And the Depression's such an interesting thing because they literally came in and were like, no, society is a social organization. We can actually, all these decisions are actually political. We can just choose not to have homeless people, right? We can choose not to have unemployment. We can just choose to build things if we want to build things, right? In a way they sort of demystified money in a way that neoliberalism and monetary theory has remystified it, right? That money has some magical power, some magical inherent thing, as opposed to not just a political decision on whether you want to make it and give it to somebody, right? Like it has nothing to do with,
It is a total political decision. It's like who deserves the money, Is it the military and rich people, or is it poor people and the working class? Who's worthy enough? And I don't know if you guys or anybody listening to this has read George Lakoff, but he talks about like the different models on the left and right. And it's like who's on the right. It's, you work hard, and if you're rich, that means, we're all familiar with this, but like his book, Moral Politics, goes into it. Super interesting, but it is a political decision. It's like, who is worthy of receiving money? Well, it's not poor people. It's not people of color. It's, the rich people who got there because they worked really hard. And so now we should give them even more money. And it's just maddening to realize that the scarcity is total bullshit. And that like somebody told me that her mom, who lives on the peninsula, is living on a fixed income and has to choose between paying her housing and paying her prescriptions. And there's literally no reason for it to be that way. It is a total nonsensical bullshit construct. There's no reason that she has to do that. It's completely maddening to realize.
There's no good reason.
No good reason.
Yeah, well, no moral
There's
reason.
some bad
right?
reasons.
And I think
rich people exist.
Yeah, when we look in these crises, whether it be 2008 or the Great Depression, right, the other thing that we see is that when the state wants to accomplish a goal, right, and that goal is large, it sheds the pretense of these sort of market, fundamentalisms, right? So it completely sheds the pretense of austerity in the face of the 2008 housing crash and just dumps money on the banks, right? Because they know where their bread is buttered. But again, during the New Deal or whatever, when the state wanted to fight this war and it felt that it had to, it just mobilized the things and did them, right? And it actually shed its market pretenses and was like, you know what, we're actually not going to have competition. We're going to have price controls because that's way more efficient. And actually, and so it is kind of, again, I think it's one of these like interesting metaphors that some people want to get, sometimes want to give it up because of course the 30s were a racist time and all this, a lot of horrible things happened in the 30s too. But I think some of those things are important to remember, right? Like, there was a time where we decided that, the market doesn't have to rule our lives. And we actually decided that it's actually really inefficient to let it rule our lives too. Like it actually makes our lives much more miserable in the end. But
yeah, definitely. And it's a total fiction. I mean, just we don't have a free market. And I think it was Hickenlooper had a tweet recently where he's like, what we need is more free market, more of a free market and tax incentives. I'm like, that's self-contradiction, you idiot. Come on. You want tax incentives and a free market? That's an oxymoron. You're just blatantly putting it out there. What we want is like free market rigged for us and the rest of you can suck it.
Well, it was interesting that the Cold War completely wove together what would become like neoliberal economics and right evangelicalism, because under neoliberalism the market really is just a religious symbol, right? Like it's a mystical force, right? And that's why it doesn't have that's why you can say that, right? Because it doesn't have a form, it doesn't have like anything like that, right? So of course you can say, well, we need free market and we need tax incentives, because one is a thing that we pray to, and who knows what it looks like, and the other is the thing that is the fruit that it gives us.
Yeah.
But all of this is kind of going to something foundational that you have on your campaign page, which is that this lie that things take time, that we just have to wait, and this Obama incrementalism is sort of hogwash, and we can have the future that we want today. We just have to do it. And so, I mean, on that note, I'm wondering maybe if you could tell us a little bit about Derek Kilmore. I know in my reading he was endorsed by, he was one of the most pro-business Democrats in Olympia when he was one of the state Congress people. And then the Seattle Times also hailed him as a problem solver who can be bipartisan.
Oh, a reformer with results. Cool.
And I know, again, reading through some of your proposals and your campaign materials, that he has some questionable, he's received some questionable contributions. So can you tell us like how he fits into this picture?
Yeah, definitely. And I mean, he's the 9th most conservative Democrat in the House, and that's in GovTrack.us ranking. He's the chair of the New Democrats Coalition, which is the major pro-business conservative Democrat caucus in Congress. Yeah. And in that position, he fundraises millions of dollars, which he then distributes to himself and other establishment politicians, the DCCC, state parties, etc. He also belongs to the Problem Solvers Caucus, which is
no.
Yeah, so you're fans of that. Anybody not familiar, it's funded by dark money and Republican billionaires, and it works to advance conservative policies, and it's awful. And he voted to cut food stamps for 1.7 million people. He refuses to support Medicare for all or the Green New Deal. He's just a very conservative Democrat, and he says the right things about social issues, but he, in so many ways, is just Republican light. And there's not really an excuse for it. Like, our district has had a Democratic representative since the 60s. It's very blue, like even in the Republican revolution.
Even in a safe seat.
Yeah.
Conservative. Interesting. Yeah. This is a new story I'm hearing.
Yeah, it's just it's I mean, there's no reason for him to be that conservative. Yeah. And our district is also very working class and blue collar. And we would really benefit from having a federal jobs guarantee, healthcare for everyone. Major issue across the district is addiction. And there are people literally dying in line waiting for detox rehab treatment. We need it. And so this kind of incrementalist, well, let's be more realistic. Like, how can you go to church every Sunday and talk about realism when people are dying? Like, that's morally unrealistic.
Sure. Yeah.
I feel like Washington State, I mean, we talk about this on the Seattle level, but Washington State, this is obviously true of, where I think in the rest of the country, like you've got all these congressional seats where the Democrats are like, well, we have to run the most conservative Democrat possible because it's the only way to win this. But here in Washington, for some reason, you almost don't even have to do that. You run conservatives who would be Republicans in any other place, and you just pretend that they're not conservative. Like, that's what the Seattle City Council, our mayor here. These are people who, in a different context, would just be Republicans, and that's this.
Well, this is the state that had the senator for 40 years. That on the floor of the Senate, they would call him up as the senator from Bowen. Like, what a joke. But yeah.
It's just weird. It's part of this bizarre fiction that we like to tell about ourselves here. That this is some progressive stronghold or something, and it could be, but. That has been co-opted completely by conservatives and corporatists.
Yeah, absolutely. And I mean, Washington State, with the exception of Pramila Jayapal, actually Democrats and Republicans alike, is a very conservative delegation.
Yeah.
Like Pramila Jayapal is our progressive, the lone progressive. And it's really sad because, the Washington State Democratic Party platform is very progressive. It calls for single payer health care, but then, their representatives, except for Jayapal, don't support it. And then when we say, okay, well, let's run somebody like me or others who are running against, like, oh, how dare you? It's like, I'm more Democratic than he is. I support Medicare for all. Like, I go down to all the list of your own platform, and I'm more of a Democrat.
Oh, yeah. Well, but you won't get the money, though. I think we all know where that's coming from. But, so, I mean, I think the thing about your opponent voting to pull food stamps is interesting and probably a good inroads to talk about a particular town in your district, right? Which you brought up, Aberdeen, 16,000 people, 1,000 of which are homeless. It's this town that I think is like an absolute fact in America and has been talked about for maybe, ever since Trump got elected, talked about incessantly, which is these rural towns that are more or less dying and have been dying for decades, where there's mass poverty and like not a lot of work or anything like that. And, the national narrative has been, for some reason, that means that they all want to vote Republican. But obviously, you have a slightly different point of view. And as we see from your opponent, I mean, he's literally taking food out of their mouths by pulling food stamps, right? I mean,
yeah, he really is. And it's, going to Aberdeen, it is really stark. When you have 1,000 people homeless in a town of 16,000, it's going to be very stark. You're going to see it. And I went there once so the Washington Poor People's Campaign they have a very active group in Aberdeen, and they do, it's called Chaplains on the Harbor. And I'd recommend, actually, they just started a farm that's started, run, founded, worked on by poor people and people who have been incarcerated, and they do CSA shares. So everybody go check it out, get a CSA share. And anyway, I went to a food bank that they were doing. And then as I was driving out of Aberdeen, it was a really hot day and the sun was beating down. And I came up to a busy intersection, and there was a guy just sitting cross-legged on a manhole smack dab in the middle of the intersection with sweat pouring down his face, down his body, just sitting there. And then I was at a red light just watching this, and then the cross street had the green light, and the cars would just come up, go around him, keep going. And when I had the green light, rolled up to him, I was like, "Are you okay?" And I gave him, it's like $2 for the bus, but it's like, what do you have to be going through to just sit cross-legged on a manhole in the middle of traffic? And you're just like, this is what I'm doing now. Like, I'm so drunk or so high or so depressed and suicidal that I do not care if I get run over just sitting here. And that's the kind of thing. And so all this incremental bullshit doesn't address like the pervasive despair that people feel. Like, you have to be very despairing to either get that drunk or high, or to just sit there and just let that happen. And it's kind of a symbol of all over the district. Like, you cannot get a job working 40 hours a week at minimum wage and live and have a decent life. And you don't have anything to look forward to. And so all this incrementalist bullshit doesn't address, like, how do we create national policies and empower localities like cities and counties and states to use policy so that people can have a life that they actually want to live in and not check out of with drugs and alcohol.
Yeah, and I think, your sort of response to this is, some sort of response of community and compassion or whatever.
Empathy, maybe.
The conservative response, you actually tweeted out at one point from one of their council members. I believe his name is Karen Rowe, but we'll double check that later. But Rowe, in a city council meeting says we're not entitled to get something for the mere fact that we are alive, right?
That's exactly the conservative thing in a nutshell. It's like, actually, we're breathing. And policy is to show that we care about you and we don't want you to just die in a gutter. It's just insane.
Yeah, well, I think it's the deeply inhuman and inhumane sort of politics that we've lived under for 40 years, right? Have bashed into our heads.
Yeah, and this reaction you're having to this person in the street is one of empathy. And it's easy to say, though, that the opposite reaction of saying, well, you don't deserve anything for being alive is a conservative one, and it is, but it's also what we think of in this town, ultimately in Seattle here, as the liberal response. Because again, we have this very confused idea of where we stand on politics, where people, but here we have Seattle is becoming like a national poster city for sort of antagonism of the homeless and demonization, and we have this perfect liberal managerial ethic of meritocracy, where that embodies the way we look at everything, which is, well, yeah, you can't get something for free. If you are in that place that you are, you must deserve it, because
there's no other way you'd be there.
Yeah, it's self
He
reinforcing.
should have chosen to go to a coding academy as opposed to sit in the middle.
Yeah,
of
have
the
you
road,
courted Amazon for Aberdeen or Microsoft?
And it's also
Facebook?
like helps them assure themselves that they too are not one paycheck away from total disaster, because they're good people and they went to a coding academy and like they think Amazon's great and they get their groceries delivered by fucking drone or whatever.
Yeah.
So like that could never happen to them.
Yeah, right.
Well, and I think too, in your platform you bring up under the sort of Medicare for all, which you certainly support, you bring up this issue of free treatment for an expanded treatment of people that have like drug issues, but also free treatment of mental illness issues and things like that too. And I think those kind of go together. So those are two extremely stigmatized like facts of American society, right? Both issues that are caused by just what a fucking cruel, awful place we live in. But they're stigmatized and then used to beat the victims of our economy relentlessly. Like, so in Seattle, we have the awful Como Seattle is Dying fucking movie, and they just had another one come out yesterday, which
So they're doubling down on that.
Oh yeah.
Yikes. I haven't seen the new one.
To the point that it's like 1/3 footage from the original.
my
But
gosh.
It's basically the
It's a
uranium
clip show.
powering the.
It's a clip show.
it's the Rocky Five of yes, I think it's really important to guarantee that as a free service, right? Because you're trying to help people who have been like essentially victimized by the world that we live in. At the same time, too, it's important about lifting the stigma on mental health issues and drug issues and things like that too. So I was wondering if you maybe speak on that a little bit.
Yeah, and I think Medicare for All needs to include mental health treatment and drug and alcohol treatment. And like across my district, I mentioned the Poor People's Campaign, the pastor there, she actually has tattooed on her arm the initials of people that she pastored who have died waiting in line for treatment. And like addiction, alcoholism, mental health, like these are very common issues in American society. And it's just kind of absurd that we stigmatize it. And, in Tacoma, that's where I got sober. I've been sober for almost 3 years from alcohol. And I'm open about it. I didn't want it to come out with like opposition, dig it up or whatever, because Tacoma's small and, recovery community is small. But just feel like I was being honest with them. But also like, I have an understanding of what alcoholics and addicts need, and I will fight for that and not just allow this endless prevarication and incrementalism, because, I do know people who have relapsed, and I know people who have died, and I've been with a friend of mine who was trying to get sober for a long time and called me extremely intoxicated. Tacoma Detox is the only place in Tacoma that takes people, takes Apple Health, the state healthcare, and they're always full. And so you have to call them at 12:01 in the morning every day to see if they have a bed. They never do. So I took her to the ER and they kept her overnight. Her blood alcohol was 0.34, lethal is 0.4. So she was very close. And if you are at the point she was at, you need to be medically detoxed, because if you just stop drinking, you could die. And so detox typically should be 3 days, but ER only kept her overnight until she was sober enough to talk to a social worker and be released, in a state of mind to make a decision. And so they did that, and then it was like 3 weeks before she could get into rehab. And the thing about people like alcoholism, addiction, is like when somebody becomes willing, you need to make sure they get what they need right then, and not just kind of slip back into it. And so, you know, she did end up going into treatment, but it's like this is just absolutely insane. It's like getting back to MMT. We have all the resources, we have all the money. Like every alcoholic and addict in the district, in the entire country, could have treatment available to them when they need it, as long as they need it to get clean and sober, stay clean and sober. And we just don't have it because of this fiction of incrementalism and, you know, the household budget.
Yeah.
So, we're all going to choke on the ashes of civilization anyway, unless maybe you could talk to us about, you know, another issue that we talk about in this campaign here in the city has been talked about a lot, you know, because the certain good candidates want to enact a Seattle Green New Deal. But once again, this is a good thing we should do, but that really needs to be solved on a global level with a full commitment of the U.S. government. Talk to us about climate change.
Yeah.
Climate change, good or bad?
It's absolutely good. Yeah.
Pros, more beach space.
Yeah, exactly. I mean, the climate crisis, and with the 2030 deadline, you know, that's part of the reason I decided to run. Like the advice I was given was like, oh, that's great, you want to run, you know, just spend the next 10 years building up your resume. I was like, we'll be way past 2030 by then, and we'll still, instead of a 48-year-old Derek Kilmer, we'll have a 58-year-old Derek Kilmer telling us we can't do it. And needs to happen now. And in my district, we're having, I think it was here in Seattle as well, it was a year or two ago when there were wildfires in BC, and we had ashes falling from the sky. And it's like, are we living in a post-apocalyptic movie? Like, this is real. This is climate change happening. And there's also the Makah Nation on the northernmost part of the Olympic Peninsula. I was up there for their annual Makah Days and talking to some leaders there, and they were telling me about the issues they're facing. So their school, the Makah Nation school, is in a tsunami zone, and you know, tsunamis are going to get worse as the sea level rises. And their current tsunami evacuation plan is for the kids to just run up a hill a mile and try to outrun the tsunami.
That should work.
Yeah. And like they need money to relocate the school, and that should be part of the Green New Deal. And the village of Tohola, the Quinault Nation, they've been there forever. It's like they're losing so much by having to leave that space, but they have to because of rising sea levels. It's costing over $1 million to relocate the village. In Aberdeen, I was out canvassing, and I was at a low-income apartment complex, and this woman told me that every time the river floods, which is going to happen more with climate change, every time that happens, it sends sewage up around the apartment building, like on the sidewalk. So this is stuff that we really need to fix, and I think you're really right. Like, it's good that cities should do as much as they can, but it is a national and global problem, and to do things like a federal jobs guarantee to transition us to a fossil fuel-free economy, like that's a major undertaking. It is like, as they talk about, you know, World War II scale mobilization. And I love the Green New Deal for so many different reasons. Like one being that it actually is about the frontline communities, people of color, poor people, the working class. There's not treated as like an afterthought. It's inherently part of it. And it also, with the federal jobs guarantee, it's just an ingenious combination of so many things we need, like good union jobs and then a major overhaul to address the climate crisis.
Yeah, and I think, you know, people maybe even now are completely underestimating the scale of what we're talking about, right? Because you talk about, you know, you have these tribes people that, you know, need to move, right? Like they need to be relocated because of what climate change is going to do. But whole urban areas, millions of people, right?
Yeah, like Miami.
Relocated.
Miami's dealing with that right now, basically.
Yeah, and this is one of these things that if we continue to exist under this sort of neoliberal austerity logic, is going to be impossible, right? I mean, Seattle can't even build like a simple bit of mass transit because it's just impossible under the current logic, right? I mean, so what we need, I think the thing's interesting about the Green New Deal is you actually do have to fundamentally change how you think about politics and how things get done, right? I mean, we're not moving Miami.
Can we just
and being budget hawks?
Do you think if we ask Elon Musk really nicely, he might be able to figure it out for us?
Oh, he's a nice guy, and he's really rich, so he must be really wise.
He's the Tony Stark of our age, right?
I definitely want to be on an Elon Musk branded rocket shot directly into the sun.
I mean, I do have to say, it's really disheartening to hear that those climate impacts are hitting places like Aberdeen. I mean, the coast makes sense, but like Aberdeen flooding, I mean, those are the stories that we've been hearing about in Miami, but that makes sense because it's, like at sea level.
And
so
honestly, if it's
it's no, I gotta say, it's no great loss.
First off,
but it will impact a lot of people. But I think that's the thing. It's kind of one of those invisible phenomenon for a lot of people. And so it's an easy thing to abstract. And like, yes, we had a bad summer, but like this summer wasn't as bad as they said. And so I feel like the real urgency of this is diminished. And the more that we can share these stories of real impacts, like in our state, maybe will be helpful. So
yeah. Well, I think the thing about Aberdeen is interesting too, because kind of like what's happening internationally, the same thing is going to happen domestically, which is the people who are going to get really fucked by climate change are the people that we've already given up on and said fuck you to and like pushed to the margins. And, much like that guy sitting in the middle of the road in Aberdeen needed like some empathy in his life, like we're gonna have to actually like develop empathy for other people.
Yeah, and I mean, I just imagine like, what if we just continue with this austerity logic and the scarcity and just the neoliberalism, let it keep happening? What do they hope will happen? It's like we just have waters covering everything except the high points in America where the rich people will retreat to and have the islands they always wanted.
Yeah.
Well, yeah, that's the thing.
Seasteading.
The seastead will be real.
I think that's important to think of it that way, in that it's really not about necessarily convincing people anymore at this point. All the people in power know exactly what is going down. Every rich person, every corporate CEO, every politician in the world. It's just about seizing that power and taking it away from the people who don't care, because it's not going to meaningfully affect their lives,
Yeah, I mean, I think it's time to give up on the idea that they just don't get it or whatever.
Yeah.
And I think maybe the perfect example, which Adobe Klein actually brings up in her book, but I was in South Texas when Katrina happened, right? And I remember having friends who had gone to the Ninth Ward afterwards and stuff like that, and showing these pictures and the devastation in the Ninth Ward and the poor areas of New Orleans. And then they were showing these photos of, one of the wealthy neighborhoods of New Orleans that had this like 8-tier like water buffer system that was like scientifically designed to like repel rising water and all this shit. And their neighborhood was fine. And, they had their own police that shot at people who tried to like march across a bridge into the neighborhood. So, I mean, it's one of those things of like, the plan's already there. They've already fortified, the thing. But the rest of us, they're not going to let us in, right? When we go knocking on the Ark door, they're not going to open it. Yeah. No, I think we need to realize that
How
now.
pure is your blood, Brian? That will be the real question.
Yeah, exactly.
Yeah, no one wants Brian's blood.
Well,
it's just Big Red.
Honestly, as much as everybody hated it, the most prophetic film of our generation is going to turn out to be 2012, because they build the giant arcs for all the rich people, and as the world's burning and drowning, they have all these Chinese workers who build the arcs, and they literally kick them off the fucking arcs. All the rich people kick the fucking workers off the arcs so they can take off and survive and kill every poor person on the planet and
Sounds
continue their
right.
way of life. Yeah.
Yikes.
And that is going to be the most prophetic movie of our time. Yeah. John Cusack classic. Go look it up, guys.
Yeah, wasn't that Roland?
Sounds really fun.
Roland Emmerich should be our most beloved director.
Don't watch the movie, just look into the future.
Yeah.
Don't worry. You don't have to watch the movie. You're going to live it in about 20, 30 years.
We've been talking for a long time. Do we want to talk about Tacoma in general?
I guess I would say one thing that I've found really interesting thinking about the district is, so Grays Harbor went for Trump, and it was the first time that Grays Harbor had gone for the Republican president in a long time, like 70, 80 years. And so the centrists are saying, of course, that means we need to go even more Republican light. But I have friends out there, and one friend who grew up there, all his family's Republican. He's a big Bernie supporter, but he's part of the culture. He loves it there. He said the peninsula is not getting more Republican, it's getting more populist. And they chose the option that they thought was the populist option that was was speaking to their needs. And so to people, it's like, oh, the mythical Trump voter, and what are we going to do and all this stuff. And, you know, people outside of Seattle maybe think, well, we're not Seattle. Like we can't run a democratic socialist and all this stuff. And like even my district, people say, oh, well, that's not Seattle. We can't do it. It's like, yes, we can. These are working class policies. And I've been out canvassing with a group working for the Green New Deal in Aberdeen. And their goal is to make sure that the Green New Deal benefits rural Washington and not just the city. So we were going out and asking them, what do you want to be part of the Green New Deal? And we showed them a list of policies, and it was stuff like single-payer health care, federal jobs guarantee, more union jobs, all of this stuff. And even people who voluntarily, we did not ask them, they just volunteered and told us they voted for Trump, looked at it and said, well, I don't know, it's hard to say because I really like all of these. And so that's the thing I would say. It's like, it does get very, it can feel kind of crushing under the weight of like the neoliberalist endless austerity. Like, how can the corporate onslaught of money over our politics? But people want a change, and like we're in this amazing moment with like people like Bernie Sanders and AOC and like DSA members across the country, where like we have the working class politics, and when we talk to the working class and tell them about it, they respond. And when we go and we're not with this elitist democratic, look, I have a PhD, so I understand what's wrong with your life better than you do, and you actually don't even have it that bad because GDP, blah blah blah. Like if we go in and we just talk to them and we're like, you should be able to get an education if you want one and not have to live in your car, and you should have all these things. And so that's what I would say is like, there is hope, and it's with like the kind of DSA working class democratic socialist, like true progressive policies. And I think it's that we can do a lot.
Yeah.
It turns out it's not that hard to sell something that's actually good.
Exactly. Yeah.
I'm going to give you a dignified life is not a tough sell.
The Democrats have spent, the last 4 decades trying to sell dog shit to people.
Well, they're saying, we'll give you the life you deserve.
They are.
Exactly,
They're saying exactly that. And then what? You deserve an awful, miserable,
unless you get
undignified
a
life.
But I think that's two important things to remember too. As much as maybe people are depressed at Trump winning over Grays Harbor or whatever, right? Is that the vast majority of people still don't vote, right? Because they hate both parties, because both parties offer them dog shit. And so there's lots of people to win out there. And the other thing is that national representatives from smaller areas or whatever can have a big impact on the national scale. And AOC and Illinois are both like very good representatives of that. There's a lot of things that we're talking about nationally that we're only talking about because they got elected, right? And even though we're far from Brooklyn or Minnesota, right, that it doesn't matter,
Yeah, definitely.
Well,
cool.
Yeah, thank you so much, Rebecca, for coming on the boat, especially for making that long trek, having to stand all the way on the light rail.
I know that you had to stand all the way. I know you had to stand all the way in the bus, but why'd you stand on top of the bus? That's the part that we don't understand.
It's confusing, yeah.
So if people want to follow your campaign, they can check out your website, which we'll link to, which is Rebecca for WA, like WA. And there's a link to volunteer there, and there's also a link to donate. And it looked like all of your social handles were the same, Rebecca for WA on Facebook, Twitter, and Instagram. And we'll link to all those. Was there anything else that you would like to shout out or plug now?
Tacoma, it's awesome. Thanks for having me on the show.
Oh yeah,
Thank you.
Tacoma, check it out.
Maybe we'll sail down to Tacoma and do a show from there.
Yeah,
sail down I-5.
You were joking about that, Brian, weren't you?
Oh yeah.
We were
As
gonna
Rebecca
surprise
driving
you.
up here, we should sail the boat down.
Right.
Yeah.
Awesome.
Cool.
Well,
Thank you.
everyone, get excited about Rebecca's campaign, and we should actually primary all of these shitty Democrats.
Yeah, for sure.
Yeah.
You're
Yep, we should.
doing us all a service. Thank you.
Thanks for coming on.
Thanks.